Alright, the thumbnail's a bit bitchy, but this channel's small enough that I need to do something to get your attention or resign myself to being ignored. Also, I might be a bit bitchy. But what's this about anyway? Why do I want your attention? Well, on May 23rd, in the year of our Lord 2020, Shadiversity, a history channel that I've appreciated for some time, released a video titled, Does Objective Quality Exist? And if it does, how to find it? A video essay, in which he proposes a model for objective art analysis. A small bit of context. For a while now, Shad has frequented EFAP, Every Frame a Pause, the live stream and podcast of Mahler, the Long Man himself, YouTube's champion of objective film criticism, in which he, the doggo, and a host of guests respond to subpar video essays. So, I've been expecting this video. And now that it's here, it's the most succinct explanation of the beliefs of a supposed objective art critic that I know of. It's still 39 minutes, so I'm not going to do a sentence-by-sentence critique. Instead of showing his entire video within this one, I'll do a certain amount of skipping to what I see as the main points, and a certain amount of summary because beyond there being some indulgence in the writing that can easily be edited out without affecting the argument, I have far too many small quibbles with the video on a sentence-to-sentence basis for me to go through the video with a fine-tooth comb without obscuring the overarching argument that I actually care about. That said, the argument's complicated enough that I think it'll be best to start slow and go through the video in that direct way until he's revealed the foundations of his argument. Alright, that's enough of my introduction. Let's look at Shad's. There's a minute-long ad read that we'll skip past, then intro, and we're at the introduction.
Or are they called film essays?
Oh, no, my mistake. Some of that indulgence is front-loaded. Jokes about video essayist tropes that aren't really well enough delivered to warrant your time. Video essayists do that voice, and use music to emotionally manipulate. Along similar lines, a made-up quote to garner authority.
Very similar to the philosopher Junkev Voinkvanek said, authority and credibility is but an illusion of perception. Which I just made up right then.
Which he didn't actually make up. It's a pretty close adaptation of a Josna Kalin quote from Words of Radiance, which I know he's read. The first book of the series is even displayed on the shelf behind him. Anyway, 2 minutes into the video, and we're finally getting to the actual introduction.
Because screw all that, I'm just going to be talking about facts and logic here. What facts and logic am I talking about? I want to talk about the very concept of quality. What makes something good or bad? Because this is a deeply interesting subject for me as someone who likes to try and create things of quality. I want to make stuff that is good. Perhaps even great. I want to make things of the greatest quality possible, but to do that, there are a lot of things I need to try and understand. This is both as a YouTuber, content creator, but also as a storyteller. I'm a writer, novelist, and in my quest to try and learn how to create things of true quality, of exceptional quality, in fact, I have learnt some very interesting things that I want to share with you. Now, this will be instructive for people who want to create things of quality, but also for those people who want to try and review something to see how good it is. And so we start with a deeply philosophical question. What is good, or what is quality?
So that's our task, a search for good. First of all, we'll need to define what we mean when we say good. For this sort of work, if it's at all workable, I like to use the first definition that Google spits out to approach something closer to consensus definitions and to make sure that I'm not gerrymandering the conversation too much. So, there's 2 definitions we might consider. 1. To be desired or approved of, and 2. Having the qualities required for a particular role. The first of these is a prescriptive judgment, and by far the more common use of the word good. The second is descriptive. You simply make a comparison and refrain from commenting on whether or not something should conform to the role that you're comparing it to. In practice, this one tends to be a linguistic redundancy. A triangle has 2 angles and 3 sides, and so a square is not a good triangle. Or you could drop the extra word and simply say that it is not a triangle. This definition is important to note because in contexts precisely like the one that we're dealing with, it gets used in manipulative ways fairly regularly. You can make a logically sound argument that something is bad, while really just saying that it's not the thing you're comparing it to. And if you leave your definition of good vague enough, then draw comparisons to things that people generally desire, you can rely on people assuming that you're using the first of these definitions, and that the bad thing should be changed. Then, at a later point when people criticize your argument, you can clarify that you were only making a descriptive statement, meanwhile the connotation of the word survives and animates people. Additionally, the majority of people will have only seen the original argument, so the original good functionally cements itself as a prescriptive statement. This sort of thing is one of the reasons that debates of this sort can become such a mess. Because language is the medium through which we convey our arguments, manipulative linguistic tactics open up avenues to success, the effect of which is that language becomes a roadblock between ourselves and accurate understanding of reality, rather than an effective means of representing it. Shad, of course, isn't doing this. He couches his first few mentions of the word good in desire.
I want to make stuff that is good, perhaps even great. I want to make things of the greatest quality possible.
It's pretty clear that he's using a prescriptive meaning of good, and that only becomes more clear as his argument goes along a prescriptive route later on. Let's continue.
Because quality only exists with a point of reference. Without such, the mere concept of quality does not exist. For something to be considered good, we need a standard to measure it against.
You sound like a subjectivist already. Shad's argument might be abnormal from what a typical, sort of objectivist thinker might argue. I'm not entirely sure, but in my experience, the thing that people tend to like about objectivity is that they get away from relativism. There's simple standards, simple rules that you can rely on. It's difficult to say if this will map... Well, it's difficult to say how many arguments this will map onto. But that's irrelevant to Shad's argument, which is what I'm offering critiques to today. Anyway, this will be a good time to outline some of my own thinking, because things will get very scattered and obscured if I just drop breadcrumbs throughout the video as I respond to them. So, we are trying to determine whether or not and how good exists. So we need a standard for determining if something exists. Luckily, there's a very straightforward one available. For something to exist, it must have physical form. If we cannot indicate where and what something's physical form might be, we can't act like it exists. The standard does discount the supernatural, and I'm pretty comfortable with that because by definition we can't interact with the supernatural to either confirm or falsify its existence. Although if I'm not mistaken, Shad is religious, so this standard may be disagreeable to him. With that in mind, I'll clarify that I'm not using this standard as a comment on religion. It's just that faith isn't a workable standard if we're aiming to reach a conclusion. You'll give Mormonism, I'll give Christianity, and with our standards equally being faith, that'll end the conversation. So let's please not go into theology. That said, there's two ways for things to have physical form. They can either be matter themselves, or a property of matter. For example, the heart pumping blood is an emergent property of all the matter that amounts to the heart and blood. Pumping has material form even if it isn't matter itself. So, in looking for good, let's start with matter itself, because this one's easy. To this day, a value particle has not been discovered. Yeah, theories of intrinsic value aren't really based on anything. So objective value as an emergent property. These arguments can run in a number of different ways, but the one that I think I've seen most, and which is relevant to this video, runs along the lines of suggesting that objects have purpose inherent in their form. For instance, the purpose of a knife is to cut, therefore a good knife cuts well. This argument is thoroughly intuitive to us because it's useful to see the world in terms of function, but this argument falls apart upon closer examination. Let's apply our test. What is the physical form of the knife's purpose, and where does it exist? Alone, the knife is steel shaped into a thin wedge with a vaguely cylindrical wooden object at the bottom. Without a person involved, the knife is merely inert matter. The purpose of cutting ascribed to the knife is just the most effective use of the knife that we'd expect any reasonable person to ascribe to the object, based on standard human values. So rather than calling cutting the purpose of the knife, it would be more accurate to call it the purpose that we have for the knife. This purpose we've been discussing is ideation about how the knife could be used, and therefore exists, has a physical form, as neurons firing in some configuration within our brains. With the definitions of objective and subjective that I've tended to use in this sort of discussion, that would obviously make this form of value subjective. If we take Google's first definition for subjective, based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions, then our ideas about how the knife ought to be used are opinions based on values or tastes. Secondly, it is an assertion of how the knife ought to be used. So we need to make a distinction between perceived purpose and the prescriptive implications that flow from it, which in this argument amount to good. Anyone who's had any cursory contact with philosophy should know where I'm going with this. David Hume's is-ought distinction. There are two types of claims, descriptive and prescriptive. Descriptive claims describe what is. These are simply facts, and claims about them will be testable. On the other hand, prescriptive claims advocate for facts. We have notions of possible worlds that would be better and worse based on either our own values or the values of some collectivized amalgamation of humanity. When we say that something should or should not happen, we are saying that it is more or less consistent with our ideal world. Oftentimes this is an overt counterfactual, but even if we are saying that the world should be as it is, there is a gap in our logic. Facts simply are. Whether or not they ought to be is not a fact, and because of that, an ought cannot be derived from an is. That is to say that if you make a strictly factual claim, you only describe what is in your premises, then an ought or a should in your conclusion will not logically follow from the premises you have developed. The relevant flaw with the knife argument is that it disguises people's opinions as a fact about the knife. The notion that the knife should be used to cut isn't contained within the steel of its blade, but in the minds of man. And in this sense, the opinion does have a physical form, as neurons firing in some configuration. However, to go further than claiming that an opinion exists, but that it is correct, is a different claim entirely, one that we can only assess by returning to the thing that the opinion pertains to. If your opinion is that the knife is made of steel, you can be correct depending on the factual properties of the knife. However, if we attempt to verify the purpose of the knife by observing the object the claim is being made about, we won't find answers. The claim was initially based in opinion of the object, so the best we can get is that the object directs us back to the opinion, which directs us to the knife, and back to the opinion, and around we go. The claim about the knife's material was descriptive. The nature of what a good knife ought to be in respect to its purpose, however, is prescriptive. It is not a factual claim, so the concepts of correct and incorrect do not map onto it. Thirdly, as with most philosophy, there's a certain amount of linguistic trickery that goes into this argument. When I say the word knife, you get an image of a knife in your head, or not everyone has visual imagination, but you have an idea about what the knife is, so when asked what would be the purpose of the knife, you observe your knife and think about its best use. Now everyone has a different, abstract knife in their head that'll be influenced by every knife you have interacted with, as well as general ideas about what knives are and do as expressed by others. The archetypal knife you have in your head is what you use to define knives, to the extent that if someone pulled out a half-full carton of orange juice and expressed to you that this is the platonic ideal of what a knife is by which all other knives may be defined, you would reject their definition. Point is, a key feature of your knife will be sharpness, so when you observe it, it makes perfect sense that you would conclude it should be used to cut. If, however, I were to give you an actual knife that from use had been chipped in a number of places along the blade, and from disuse had rusted away into a rather brittle form, that suggested use of cutting would no longer make sense. If you suggested that this knife's purpose was to cut, your conclusion would have nothing to do with the object sitting in front of you. So when the argument is that the purpose is inherent in the form of the object, and one of the conclusions often drawn from this sort of argument is that a bad knife is one that does not cut, we can conclude that this argument gerrymanders the result by ascribing purpose based on language rather than the object's form. Alright, this was the response video. Right, I've developed the basic outline of my argument that'll stand as an alternative to Shad's view, if not opposed to it on every point. Anyway, we can get back to his video.
This is the very same thing for the concept of big or small. You can only judge something to be big or small with a point of reference to judge it against. For instance, Mount Everest is very big in comparison to a person, and so the point of reference we're using is the size of a person. But suddenly if you switch up that point of reference to the size of planet Earth, Mount Everest suddenly becomes very small. And if you could then switch that up again to the size of a star, Mount Everest is minuscule. And what we are finding here, Mount Everest can actually be considered both large and small depending on the point of reference we are using, and this is exactly the same way in which we determine quality, or what is good. It is by the standard we are applying it against to establish a point of reference.
Right, so the properties of objects can be compared to other objects with similar properties. If we state this argument a bit more precisely, Mount Everest has one precise volume that simply exists. Volume is a scalar property, so the mountain can be compared to other objects that have more or less volume. The comparison to quality, or good and bad in this sense, would suggest that our values can be satisfied to greater and lesser extents. If that's all he means to express, we're still in agreement. If, however, he means to suggest that big and small are two separate properties of Mount Everest, rather than two equally imprecise ways of describing the same singular objective fact, then his argument relies entirely on imprecise speech, and he is incorrect.
Now, in many cases, we can actually find universal standards that exist irrespective of anyone's opinions on the matter.
Here's where the disagreement really starts. I'll simply say for now that I look forward to seeing how he finds them.
And this is where we come to a wonderful word called objectivity. When a fact is an objective truth, it is a truth irrespective of anyone else's opinions on the matter.
Right then, Shad's definition of objective uses a single criteria: factuality. This definition is pretty common and even works with my argument. Specifically, the bit about David Hume's is-ought distinction, but I dislike this definition for my own particular reasons. The term objective has a lot of definitions floating around, enough to render it useless without clarification, and no matter how careful you are with your definitions, connotations will always follow a term around. Where that connotation conflicts with the particular meaning you are trying to express, that message will tend to get lost in the weeds. So if you have the choice between the words factual and objective, factual will almost always be the better word choice. Objective makes you sound smarter, but that's a relatively small advantage in comparison to clarity. As I'm sure some of you will have noted, the definition that I offered earlier conflicts with Shad's. The definition I offered was for subjective, based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. The objective counterpart to this would look like facts unaffected by feelings, tastes, or opinions. The reason I used Google's definition for subjective rather than objective was because I had just said subjective, so it seemed appropriate, but also because Google's definition of objective doesn't apply to these circumstances that we're talking about. That definition is of a person or their judgment, not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. This only applies to people and their judgments, whereas we're talking about objects themselves. This is the thing where you say someone is being objective when they set aside their own feelings and opinions to represent facts as clearly as possible. It's related to the term we're talking about, but not the same. Alright, get it? Good. I'm trying to be impartial here. Now let's talk about Shad's definition. Of the common definitions on offer, Shad is using the one that is most favorable to his case. I won't begrudge that, but it needs to be noted that because of how he's framed the terminology, some of his arguments simply won't interface with the stances of many who voice disagreement with him on this topic. They won't examine each other's arguments closely enough, and they'll keep talking past each other by using the same term to refer to different things. Specifically, most definitions of this objective-subjective dichotomy emphasize the mind as separate from everything else that exists. The definition that you'll typically find in scientific contexts, which is more or less what I got from Google, can draw a lineage back to Descartes, who used the term to delineate a dichotomy between mind and matter. The scientific consensus at this point would obviously name that as a false dichotomy, but the emphasis on delineating the difference between what exists in the external world and what is only in your head has remained. The other important definition to note is the philosophical distinction, which runs along the same lines. In philosophy, a subject is an observer, and an object is a thing observed. So if something is a property or dependent on consciousness or personal experience, it is subjective, whereas things that exist regardless of observation or perspective are objective. I'm literally quoting the Wikipedia article. This isn't exactly high-level knowledge. Anyway, while I'm going to keep these other definitions in my back pocket to potentially comment on the broader debate, for critiquing Shad's argument, I will use Shad's definition.
But it also is a matter of correct definitions.
Oh god, please don't.
And if anyone wants to disregard what definitions are, then you're disregarding the very purpose of language. But if you can establish a uniform, consistently accepted definition of what something is, thereby establishing an objective standard for something to conform to, you can establish the objective reality of something irrespective of anyone's opinion of it.
Fine. If you want to go here, we can. Personally, I think you would be best served by keeping the concept of language as far away from this debate as possible, because the subjectivity of language is the postmodernist wheelhouse. But whatever. We'll start with this argument right here. Firstly, we'll need to keep in mind the pretense of this entire video. Shad is giving an objective argument, so with his definition, he is only allowed to talk about facts. Now, I think we all agree, most of us anyway, that language should be treated with a certain amount of reverence. Communication is far too important for it to be otherwise. But agreement doesn't count for shit in this debate. This isn't about reasonable ideas that most people will accept, it is about facts. So, if you disregard definitions, you're disregarding the purpose of language. Okay. If we were to push on this, I think the conversation would go something like what follows. What is the purpose of language? Communication. Why? Because that's what people have defined it as in a uniform, consistently accepted way. Why must we respect their definition? If I had a different opinion about language, which I don't by the way, but if someone were to believe, for instance, that the gray areas of language are useful for misleading and misdirecting people, that they can gain power over others by taking advantage of the areas where there are multiple definitions, or by creating their own new definitions that are close enough to the way people understand words to be accepted, while handily maintaining their old connotations that animate people with such intense gut reactions. For these people, the purpose of language could be just the opposite of communication. Well, you'd be disregarding the purpose of language if you didn't accept the uniform, consistently accepted definition of what the purpose of language is. Oh, not only helpful, but circular. Right, I have to assume part of his argument because this is all he's given me, but based on what's here, he smuggled his conclusions into his premises. Shad, you simply expect people to agree with you on the purpose of language, which we do, but that isn't objective. Consensus, no matter how uniform, is simply a collection of opinions. Opinions exist. I mentioned physical forms earlier. The physical form of opinions would be neurons firing in some specific configuration. So, opinions exist factually, and with Shad's definition, not the other two, objectively. Does that mean they are correct? No. Especially not objectively. If I believe that the sun is made of cotton candy, my opinion exists. But how about you take a look up at noon and judge for yourself what my opinion's worth compared to facts? Facts now. Language has two components. First, mouth noises, and perhaps written languages for more advanced. We have vibrations traveling through the air or ink on paper. Listen to a conversation in a language that you haven't learned and judge for yourself if there's inherent meaning in the noise. The second component is our ideas about language, definitions, grammatical structures, etc., which we use to interpret the noises. I think most of us grew up with a mentality that language might as well have been handed down from God as an immutable fact that dictates how we communicate with each other. It's not. We'd like to communicate with each other, so we accept consensus definitions. Consensus is a general agreement. Agreement is harmony or accordance in opinion or feeling. Consensus definitions change all the time based on collective opinion. The word objective used to refer to a dichotomy between mind and matter, something that literally doesn't exist, and you're using definitions as a standard for objectivity. Fuck off. You know what? Let's run our test. What exactly is the physical form of correct definition as opposed to incorrect definition? Is it the prevalence of that opinion in people's minds? Yeah, we've been through this argument about opinions a few times already. Subjectively, I'm right here with you. Objectively, make a better argument. And on things conforming to definitions. That could mean a lot of different things, but the word choice is suspect. Oh, what's with the pretense? I know what the rest of your argument is. I know why you chose that word in particular. This is where you find your universal standard for judging good and bad, how well things fit the language applied to them. For the moment, I'll just say you've got the relationship backwards. Objects do not conform to the language used to describe them. They simply exist. It is our job to pick better words when talking about them so that people can better understand what it is that we are trying to communicate. There are numerous lexical gaps in our language, places where things exist entirely independent from language. When we discover a new species, for instance, that animal doesn't conform to our language accommodates it. We invent a new word that the animal is used to define. Not the other way around. The word does not define the animal defines the word. It then becomes the archetype that every subsequent use of that word refers to. Actually, there's a more specific word in this context, holotype. Here's the Wikipedia article. Long story short, if something doesn't fit your definition, you chose the wrong word. Let's continue.
For instance, the definition of a planet is very well understood, and by that definition, I, myself, Shad, am not a planet, but Earth, the planet we are on, is a planet because it conforms to that definition.
Right. Planets are things with enough mass to compact themselves into spheres by the force of their own gravity without enacting nuclear fusion, and that have cleared their own orbit of other objects. To describe you, Shad, in that way would be inaccurate. This is how the relationship works. When we find that something doesn't fit the word, we stop using that word. Once we discovered that there were a lot of other objects floating around in Pluto's orbit, and hence that it didn't meet the definition for a planet, we didn't call it a bad planet, we stopped calling it a planet. We made a new classification so we could communicate what it was more precisely. a dwarf planet.
And you can apply this logic to anything in existence according to its definition. Things will naturally conform to a definition, whatever that definition is, and these are objective facts irrespective of what people think about it.
Not exactly. You're either speaking imprecisely or you're wrong. The most charitable way of interpreting what you're saying here is that everything which does in fact exist has a particular form and our language is capable of describing that form. I dispute the second of these two. Language does a pretty good job, but there's always a level of precision that it's not capable of. Language has been designed to convey human experience, and there are things which exist outside the range of our experience. If we are incapable of describing something, the term definition doesn't apply.
But what about quality? Well, this is interrelated in a very important manner. For instance, what is a statue? A statue is a fairly specific definition, and if you have something that is carved out of stone that is meant to reflect the image or appearance of something else, well, guess what? This is conforming very accurately to what a statue is. So this, therefore, is a statue irrespective of what people think about it. But is it a good statue? Well, to figure out that, we need to apply another standard. And one of the more common standards we have for statues is for them to more accurately reflect the thing they are meant to appear as.
I have a number of small quibbles with this section. But what am I doing? I've already given my critique. Are we really going to spend the remaining 35 minutes of Shad's video playing whack-a-mole when the foundations of his argument are already this perforated? So, let's settle for a Cliff Notes version. We've gotten through the foundations of his argument, the concepts he wanted to bring up ahead of time because they would act as links in his argument later down the road. So, let's get to that later down the road. Let's track how these flaws affect various points in his argument, and eventually his conclusions. I'm going to do a lot more summary from this point on. I'll show a few quotes so you can see exactly what his wording is at key points, give my critiques, and finish this video while we're still young. If you do want all of his illustrative examples and tidbits of how all of this affects various things that he is particularly interested in, you should watch Shad's video. He's a good guy, go give him views. But for my purposes, Shad's argument can be condensed down to these premises. 1. People have subjective tastes, but when used to assess objective things, those tastes work as objective standards for what is good, because it is objective things that satisfy your tastes.
The additional thing that many people misunderstand about the very concept of subjectivity is that subjective views are actually the objective standards we are subjectively choosing to judge something by, which actually, in addition, means that they're still actually objective. Even if the standard that we are choosing to judge something by is our own personal tastes, well, our own personal tastes are actually an objective framework that we can define specifically in a specific list that we can then judge something by in a very objective framework.
2. Because tastes vary, everything can be deemed both good and bad objectively.
With this in mind, this is how something can be both good and bad according to two different standards that it is being judged against. And I see this most in reviews of entertainment media. Films, TV shows, video games, everything, where heaps of people say something is great, and then another huge group of people say it's terrible. What these groups of people are doing are applying different standards in which they are judging the medium against. And according to whatever these standards are, these people are reaching an objective conclusion. According to that standard, it is objectively good, and according to whatever other standard, it is objectively bad.
3. But there are more and less valid standards for assessing the quality of things, and these standards can be figured out from the nature of the things themselves.
But are there more valid standards that should be applied which could actually help override other standards to determine if something is truly objectively good, irrespective of the different standards that people are trying to apply to this thing to judge it against? Yes, absolutely. And most of the time, these standards can be figured out by the very nature of what this thing is, what it is meant to achieve.
He neglects to explain how in direct terms, but gives an example from which we can infer his argument. For instance, 4. A piece of entertainment is supposed to be entertaining because entertainment is its primary definition.
A piece of entertainment is supposed to be entertaining, and judging it according to how effectively it educates might not be necessarily as valid if its purpose wasn't to educate. This can seem rather odd because I often criticize movies for how often they misrepresent certain historical facts. How important is it for it to achieve the historical accuracy versus the entertainment, though? Ideally, we would want both, but if you're trying to get this thing to be as successful as it can be, and its success will be determined by how well it achieves its primary definition to be entertaining, well, the focus and most amount of effort will be put into achieving its entertainment value, not its historical accuracy standard.
And 5, if your entertainment satisfies the tastes of a target audience, it can objectively be considered good.
And this is also in conjunction to the primary target audience, because different people find different things entertaining. But if you can latch on to what a large group of people find entertaining and then try and create something that achieves their expectations, you can achieve something that is hugely entertaining for this group of people. And if you can then target a larger group of people and achieve their expectations and standards of what makes something good, what they find entertaining, you can create something that can be hugely entertaining to a very large group of people.
Let me first say that I think this is a very reasonable way of doing criticism. Shad has more or less proposed that we judge film, or story, or entertainment, whatever term, based on how the broad group of people that it is most likely to appeal to will respond to it. For a writer who wants to sell their work, that is pretty much the standard you need to use. But it boggles my mind that he thinks his argument is sound when taste is literally his standard for objective quality. To assert that the factual, physical form of something itself suggests that it should be different from what does in fact exist in reality is not an assertion of fact. Just the opposite, it is a counterfactual. Now Shad gets to his counterfactual and presents it as fact through the linguistic definitions argument that he set up toward the beginning of the video. So let's run through this with the specific example that he's given. Entertainment entertains. If something does not entertain, it is not entertainment. If something entertains a little bit, it is entertainment, if only by a little. Does the fact that it entertains a little mean it should entertain more? Objectively, no. I could see a combination of human tastes and expectations leading to the assertion that it should, that it would be good for it to entertain more, and while that desire would exist, measurably so, it is an entirely different claim to say that that desire is correct. What does correct mean anyway? I'd like to make this argument bulletproof if I can. Google says, free from error, in accordance with fact or truth. So, if my belief characterizes the world as it is, then I am correct. If I believe that reality is different from how it is, then I am incorrect. If I believe that reality should be different from how it is, then my belief is no longer trying to characterize facts, and the concepts of correct and incorrect do not map onto my belief. Prescriptive claims do not attempt to represent facts. David Hume, is odd problem, etc. We've been through this. The most interesting flaw of his example is the interaction between language and the object itself. In his example with entertainment, as with the rusty decayed knife, Shad's assertions of the object's purpose flow from the overly broad word applied to it, not the object itself. Words are our attempt to describe things that we at least think exist in reality. They come from us, not the objects. But if we do a good job with them, they will act as a close symbolic approximation that characterize the object accurately. The word fire truck will not save your burning house. The thing that the word symbolizes might. If something fails to meet the standard of entertainment that the word suggests, then you've chosen the wrong word. You're not describing reality accurately. Now let's try and address his points a little bit more directly. Premise 1.
The additional thing that many people misunderstand about the very concept of subjectivity is that subjective views are actually the objective standards we are subjectively choosing to judge something by, which actually, in addition, means that they're still actually objective.
Features A, B, and C of object X interface with my tastes and result in me considering it to be good. Alright. No one objects to the factuality of A, B, and C. Hell, most people might even agree that X is good, but the assertion that because our tastes interface with the objective reality that they exist in, the opinions and feelings that arise from them do not only exist, but are correct in their assertions of what reality should be, is fallacious. David Hume is a hot problem. You know the argument. Premise 2. Because tastes vary, everything can be deemed both good and bad objectively. Yeah, objective relativism is weird. I don't have much to say about this one. It inherits the flaws of Premise 1. Premise 3. But there are more and less valid standards for asserting the quality of things, and these standards can be figured out from the nature of the things themselves. I see this as the most important claim in his argument, and I've covered it pretty directly already. His standards do not come from the objects themselves, they come from the language that he applies to them. And if the language he applies suggests that objects should be other than what they factually are, then he is using the wrong words. Alternatively, if the words applied suggest that something should be exactly as it is, he did a good job with language, but prescriptive claims still aren't factual. Premise 4. A piece of entertainment is supposed to be entertaining because entertainment is its primary definition. Right, this one's more of an example, it flows from 3 and these same arguments apply. Premise 5. And if your entertainment satisfies the tastes of a target audience, it can objectively be considered good. There's a conclusion and a premise in that sentence. I've laid these out sort of soppily, but whatever, it does the job. Yeah, all of this flows from the previous points, and is fallacious for the same reasons. Okay, I'm done. Commenters, do me a favor. Tell me if I got anything wrong or mischaracterized this argument in any way. I'm sure you guys will have opinions, so do your best to attach an argument to your claims. As in, direct me to where I would figure out that you're right. Oh yeah, one more thing. I said I'd keep those other definitions in my back pocket to comment on the broader debate. One of the points of me bringing up those definitions, Shad, is that I think you've entered into a debate in which you simply do not understand the arguments of those who voice the opposing stance. Why do I think that? This section.
Now, this might seem really basic and obvious, and in all honesty, it is, but it's so interesting that these things need to be broken down into such specific detail because there is this interesting debate that exists in the world of the objective versus the subjective, and honestly, I feel a lot of people misunderstand this argument. There is a concept, an idea that everything is subjective, and that statement is really just warped and twisted because, first of all, that's an objective statement, and so it's a self-contradicting thing. If everything is subjective in such a way that nothing can be objective, this statement that I've just made, which is objective, contradicts itself. The obvious truth to what people are trying to say when they say everything is subjective is not that everything is absolutely subjective and not objective, is that everything can be judged in a subjective point of view. But that subjective point of view does not contradict the objective reality of what that thing is. So you can subjectively believe that a planet is actually a person, but then we're coming into a subjective decision on what a definition is, and it wouldn't really work because definitions are actually more determined by collective understanding of language.
Shad, if I were to take from among the common definitions, the one that made it easiest for me to argue the subjective nature of quality, and apply it to your argument without clarifying in any way that you mean something else by the term objective, just about everything you said in this video would sound ridiculous. But you've probably only gotten this argument from English majors who don't really know what they're talking about, who are just parroting some convenient argument their professor told them. So, if unknowingly, you've made exactly this mistake. I don't know where, but it sounds like you've come into contact with the postmodern critique of science. And you've badly mischaracterized it. So I'll clarify as best I can, even though I've only come into cursory contact with it myself. And I think it's kind of dumb. So, first of all, they're using the philosophical definition that I mentioned earlier. So when they say that everything is subjective, they mean that all of reality is predicated on conscious experience. First of all, if you use this definition, the claim isn't inherently contradictory. Conscious experience exists. Facts are contained within it, so factual claims about it are not contradictory. Now, the basis of this argument is simply following skepticism to its most extreme conclusions. We don't believe anything that we can't verify. Now, all of our beliefs about the external world, that is, reality as it exists outside of our own mind, come to us through sensory experience. So to verify that objective reality exists, we would need to verify that our senses work. Well, the only information we have to do that with comes to us from our senses, so any logic that can verify the veracity of the objective reality we experience is circular. We're left to assume one way or the other. Do our senses work, or has all of reality we experience been a conjuration of our own mind? The people who say that everything is subjective simply voice the second of these assumptions while believing the first. Everyone assumes the first of these, and lives out that belief or they wouldn't live long. Still, it's not nice to mischaracterize their arguments. Have a nice day, Shad. And to the rest of you watching, I normally talk about anime. If you're interested in that, I intend to do more of it, so consider sticking around.